Jesus pointed to something so vast, so absolute, that most of the world is still not ready to hear it plainly. He called it the kingdom within. The mystics called it the One. The ancient philosophers called it the MONAD. And right now, if you're watching this, I don't think that's an accident. Something is happening to you. Not around you. In you. You felt it. That strange restlessness that no achievement can quiet. That sense that the life you carefully built suddenly feels like a costume you've been wearing too long. The questions that used to have answers don't anymore. And underneath all of it, something enormous is pressing against the inside of your chest like it's trying to break through. That is the MONAD, pulling you back. And Jesus, more than almost any figure in human history, left a trail of teachings pointing directly to this return. Not in the sermons most people hear on Sunday mornings. In the deeper words, the hidden ones, the ones that were almost erased. I believe those teachings were hidden precisely because they were too powerful. Not dangerous, powerful. Because a person who truly understands what the MONAD is and recognizes they are already standing at its threshold cannot be controlled by fear anymore. Cannot be kept small. Cannot be convinced they are separate from the source. That's what this video is about. Not information. Recognition. So stay with me, because what comes next is going to land somewhere logic can't reach. Let me be direct with you about what the MONAD is, because most explanations make it sound either too abstract or too simple, and it's neither. The word comes from the Greek monos, meaning alone, singular, undivided. The MONAD is the concept of the Primordial One, the source before anything split into two, before light and dark, before self and other, before even the idea of I. Now here's where most people stop. They hear the source of all existence, and they nod along like it's a nice philosophical idea. But the MONAD isn't just a cosmological concept. It's a state you can actually return to. That's the part that matters. Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher-mystic who founded a secret school built on the relationship between number, music, and the soul, taught that the MONAD was not the number one. It was what existed before one, before counting even became possible, before separation even existed as a concept. And then Plotinus, the 3rd century philosopher who took mystical union and turned it into a precise inner science, described the MONAD as the overflow of pure being. Everything that exists, he said, emanates from it the way light radiates from the sun. The sun doesn't try to shine. It simply is what it is, and what it is spills outward naturally. Here's my honest opinion on this. Most spiritual traditions point toward this same reality and call it different names. But Jesus pointed toward it with a precision that I find almost shocking when you read his words without the filter of religion. He called it the Father. And I know, the moment I say that, your mind might reach for the image of a bearded figure in the clouds. But strip that image away completely. When Jesus said the Father, he was pointing to exactly what Pythagoras and Plotinus were pointing to, the origin point of all being. The ground beneath the ground. The awareness before awareness became personal. And he didn't just describe it from a distance. He claimed to be in it. I and the Father are one. That's not a religious statement about divinity in the traditional sense. That is a direct declaration of monadic consciousness, of complete non-separation from the source. The question he kept asking, in 100 different ways, was, why aren't you? There is one sentence Jesus spoke that I keep coming back to. One sentence that, once you understand it the way the early mystics understood it, restructures everything else he ever taught. The kingdom of God is within you. Luke 17 verse 21. Now, most people hear that and think, oh, it means God is in your heart. It's a nice, warm, interior feeling of faith. And they move on. But that reading is almost completely wrong. And I say that with full conviction. The Greek word used in that passage is entos. And entos doesn't just mean inside. It means prior to, underneath, more fundamental than. It's the kind of within that points to what exists before the structure of your personality, before your thoughts, before your sense of being a separate person at all. Jesus wasn't saying the kingdom is a feeling you carry around. He was saying the kingdom is the ground of your existence. The layer of you that was never born and will never die. The part of you that is already touching the MONAD, right now, whether you're aware of it or not. This is where it gets deeply personal for me, because I spent a long time reading spiritual texts and thinking the kingdom was something I needed to build toward. A destination I had to earn through the right practice, the right understanding, the right behavior. And then one day the weight of that completely collapsed. Because Jesus never said build toward it. He said it's already within you. The work isn't construction. The work is recognition. And this is what the Gnostics, those early Christian mystics who read Jesus' teachings as an inner science rather than an outer religion, understood so clearly. Gnosis, the Greek word for direct inner knowing, isn't belief. It's not faith in the traditional sense. It's direct recognition of what is already real. The kingdom isn't waiting for you to arrive. It's waiting for you to look. That shift, from seeking outward to recognizing inward, is the exact movement Jesus was pointing to every time he talked about the kingdom. And it is the first step toward the monad. Here's something I don't think gets said enough. The approach to the monad isn't silent. It has signs. And Jesus, with remarkable precision, described exactly what those signs feel like from the inside. The first one, the material world starts losing its grip on you. Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." Most people read that as advice about taxes. But esoterically, Caesar represents the entire structure of the outer world: money, status, identity, social performance. When Jesus says give Caesar his due, he's pointing to a moment in the seeker's journey where the outer world no longer feels like the real world. You still function in it. You still pay your bills and show up to your life. But something in you has quietly stopped believing it's the whole story. You felt this. I know you have. That strange sense that the world everyone around you is so invested in feels thin somehow, like a stage set. That's not depression. That's not disconnection. That's the monad beginning to make itself known. The second sign, your relationships start to crack or transform in ways you can't explain. Jesus said something that shocks people when they first encounter it. I came not to bring peace but a sword. This gets read as violence, as division. It's neither. The sword Jesus is describing is the sword of discernment, the razor-sharp inner knowing that begins cutting through every relationship, every belief system, every comfortable illusion the moment genuine awakening begins. Some people in your life will feel this shift in you, and they won't like it. That's not a problem. That's a sign. The third sign, silence becomes louder than noise. Not literal silence. Inner silence. A growing stillness underneath your thinking that starts to feel more real than the thoughts themselves. This is the monad pulling you toward it from below, from that deeper layer of entos that Jesus described. When this begins, most people don't recognize it as spiritual. They think something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. Everything is beginning to go right. The fourth sign, you stop being able to explain yourself to people who aren't on this path. And honestly, you stop needing to. That need to justify your inner life, to get permission from other people for your awakening, starts to fade. Jesus himself stopped explaining himself at a certain point. In the gospel accounts, there are moments where he simply goes silent, where words are no longer the right vehicle. That silence wasn't defeat. It was completion. In 1945, in a cave near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a farmer discovered a sealed clay jar. Inside it were ancient texts, bound leather codices that had been buried, hidden, for nearly 2,000 years. Among them was a document that would quietly explode centuries of religious interpretation. The Gospel of Thomas. Not a narrative gospel. No miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection story. Just 114 sayings. Direct transmissions attributed to Jesus. Raw. Unfiltered. And in my opinion, some of the most spiritually advanced words ever written down. Elaine Pagels, the Princeton scholar of Gnostic Christianity, who spent decades bringing these hidden texts into mainstream awareness, described the Gospel of Thomas as a document of inner experience rather than outer doctrine. And when you read it, that becomes immediately clear. Saying 3. The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourself, you will be known, and you will know that you are the sons of the living Father. That's not theology. That's a direct instruction in self-recognition. But the saying that stops me completely every time, the one that is, in my view, the most direct description of the monad in all of Jesus' recorded teachings, is saying 22. Jesus looks at infants being nursed and says to his disciples, when you make the two into one, when you make the inner like the outer and the outer like the inner, when you make the upper like the lower, then you will enter the kingdom. Read that slowly. When you make the two into one, that is the monad, not as philosophy, not as metaphor, as a precise description of a consciousness event, the moment when the perceived duality between self and source, between you and the Father, between the individual and the infinite collapses, dissolves, becomes one thing again. The fact that this text was kept outside the Bible, buried in a jar in the Egyptian desert for 2,000 years, and only resurfaced in the middle of the 20th century. I find that genuinely significant. Like it was preserved for a specific moment in human consciousness. Like it was waiting for people who were finally ready to receive it without flinching. You're one of those people. That's why you're still here. Now we get to the part that most spiritual seekers resist. The part that sounds beautiful in theory and terrifying in practice. Jesus said, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." John 12 verse 24. I want you to feel the weight of that word. Alone. The grain that refuses to die remains exactly what it is, a single, separate, isolated thing. Intact, preserved, and utterly alone. That is the ego. That is the constructed self. The story you've been telling about who you are, your history, your wounds, your achievements, your personality, your spiritual identity even. All of it. As long as you hold on to it completely, you remain a grain. Separate. Individual. Real, yes, but alone. Touching nothing deeper. The death Jesus is describing here is not physical. It is the dissolution of the separate self as the primary reference point of your existence. The moment you stop organizing your entire experience around I as a fixed, defended, continuous thing. Meister Eckhart, the 13th century Christian mystic who taught that the soul's highest function is to dissolve completely back into the ground of God, had a word for this. Abgeschiedenheit, detachment so total, so complete, that what remains is no longer a person relating to the divine. What remains is the divine relating to itself. That is the monad from the inside. And here is what I genuinely believe. This is the step most spiritual people are circling around without taking. You can accumulate knowledge. You can have powerful experiences. You can feel expanded, awakened, aware, and still be holding the grain tightly in your fist. The monad doesn't ask you to be more. It asks you to release what you've been clinging to as you. That's the instruction. It's simple. It's devastating. And Jesus said it plainly 2,000 years ago. Here is where I want to bring the whole arc of this together. Because everything I've shared with you, the monad as source, the kingdom within, the signs of approach, the hidden sayings, the death of the grain, all of it points toward one single truth that Jesus returned to again and again. You were never actually separate from the source. The parable of the prodigal son is, in my reading, the monad story told in the simplest possible language. A son leaves his father, goes far away, loses himself completely in the world of illusion and appetite, hits absolute rock bottom, and then, this is the phrase that does something to me every time I read it, he came to himself. Not he found God, not he had a revelation, not he received a teaching. He came to himself. He remembered what was already true. He turned back toward what had never actually left. And the Father, the monad, the source, the ground of being, doesn't wait at the door with a checklist of requirements. He sees the Son while he is still far off. He runs. He doesn't walk. He runs toward him before a single word of explanation is spoken. That is not the behavior of a God who requires you to earn your way back. That is the nature of a source that was never truly separated from what came out of it. The return to the monad isn't a journey across a vast distance. It's a recognition across no distance at all. You were here the whole time. The source was here the whole time. The only thing that made it feel far was the grain refusing to fall. And now, right now, in this moment, something in you is ready to let it fall. I can't prove that, but I believe it completely, because that readiness is what brought you here. Let me be straightforward with you as we close. The monad is not a concept to collect. It is not another layer of knowledge to add to your spiritual library. Everything I've shared in this video, the teachings of Jesus decoded through Gnostic wisdom, through Plotinus, through Meister Eckhart, through the hidden gospel of Thomas, none of it matters if it stays in your head. Jesus said, "Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened." Matthew 7 verse 7. That seeking isn't about finding more information. It's about the direction your whole being is pointing. It's about genuine orientation, not just intellectual curiosity, but a deep, cellular, irreversible turning toward the source. If you've watched this entire video, something in you is already oriented correctly. The seeking is real. The door is closer than you've been told. The Father, the monad, the source, the ground that Pythagoras pointed to and Plotinus mapped and Jesus lived from, is not waiting behind years of further preparation. It is within you, right now, exactly as you are. In the entos, that layer prior to your personality, prior to your history, prior to even your spiritual identity. The grain doesn't need to be perfect to fall. It just needs to let go. You've been holding on long enough. You already know this. That knowing, that quiet, unshakable recognition underneath all your thoughts right now, that is the monad introducing itself to you. Don't ignore it.